Good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to be here today with Professor Behrooz Ghamari and Professor Arash Davari talking about a number of issues related to Iran. The series that we are now conducting is under the title The Long War on Iran. And today's first session of the series is with Dr. Behrooz Ghamari under the title A Retrospective with Behrooz Ghamari. I am very delighted also to share that Arash will be my co host, and I will give the floor to Arash to introduce Behrooz and the current conversation.
We are very excited to have Behrooz here with us. He is currently affiliated with the Iranian Studies program at the University of Toronto. He is the author of 4 books, Islam and Dissent, Abdul Karim Soroush, Religious Politics and Democratic Reform in Iran. 2016, he published 2 books, Foucault in Iran, Islamic Revolution after the Enlightenment, and Remembering Akbar, and he has recently published a book titled The Long War on Iran, which is the topic of our conversation today. So we would like to begin by asking Behrooz to tell us about the book, what his motivations in writing it, and what the book is about.
Thank you so much, Bassam, for hosting this conversation, and to you, Arash, for organizing this series. The book is actually a collection of essays that I've written in the past 20 years or so. And in a sort of sense, it's a history of the present and focusing on the domestic politics in Iran, structures of power, dissent, and social movements in Iran, and then relations with the US and the effect of American policies towards Iranian domestic politics, and also related to that, some essays on American domestic politics. So the story was that I was looking for a document on my computer last year in the middle of the protest movements at Princeton during the Gaza war, the Israeli genocide of Palestinians, and accidentally I bumped into this essay I wrote in 2014, like 10 years earlier, called "The War in Gaza Wounds American Universities." And this was an essay about Stephen Salaita and the fact that his job offer was rescinded by University of Illinois because of the tweets he had on accusing Israelis of genocide in Palestine. And I thought that it was quite chilling for me because I had sort of forgotten about this piece I had written, and I thought that this is such an amazing thing that 10 years later we are still facing exactly the same issue of genocide in Palestine, and the attack on academic freedom and freedom of expression on American universities. And then I started looking at other essays I had written, like, for example, one called um, Is Iran and the US are on a collision course? And all about Iranian nuclear programs. And all these essays kind of reminded me of this piece that Lenin wrote in 1902 called New Events and Old Questions. Once you're a teenager reading Lenin, it never would leave your mind, and this obscure little essay gave me the idea of putting all these essays together as basically new events and old questions. And we see the same patterns, the same policies, the same events uh, but very much the same questions. And that same question is about repression. The same question is about colonial politics. The same question is about expansionism, empire, and every single year we go through the same cycles and try to find answers to those same questions. So I thought that putting these essays together in a book called The Long War on Iran would situate the current politics in a little bit of a short history context, particularly after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And so there you have the book, and the book is out there. It just came out a couple of days ago. And hopefully, and the timing also is very interesting because I thought that writing about current events is always difficult because the situation is very volatile and changing all the time. So the book came out exactly at the same time that we faced this kind of massive protests in Iran.
Perhaps I can ask you then to speak a little bit about the contemporary context in light of some of what you're attempting to do with the essay form. You do this quite elegant thing in the book where you talk about writing a history of the present. And eventually, I'd like for us to speak about the essay form and what it means for you to write a history of the present. But before we get into the mechanics, before we get into the method and your mode of thinking, maybe we can put the cards on the table a bit and speak to listeners about the context in which we're recording this conversation on January 16th, the specific nature of the problems before us as you see them, and how you think the book illuminates ways of thinking about the contemporary conjuncture.
It's a bit hard to analyze what is going on at this moment because of lack of communication and the flood of misinformation and sort of the ambiguity of exactly what is happening, what is unfolding on the ground in Iran. But in general sense, I think that basically since 1979, after the Iranian Revolution, we have a society of very conscious and politically aware subjects, and people who have reached a point to understand that they can basically demand their desire for a different kind of life on the streets. And every few years in Iran, we see how that consciousness, how that revolutionary subject, and which is actually collectively transferred generationally in Iran, uh, pours into the streets and form one form or another kind of social protest, uh, be it on freedom of expression, be it on women's rights, be it on student movements, workers' labor conditions, and unfortunately, all these movements happens in the context of a um, very intense and complicated geopolitics in region. And I recently wrote this essay about the question of sovereignty in Iran, and this was one of the desires of the revolutionary movement to create a sovereign state, a state that is not acting as a client to imperial powers around the world. And this is possibly the only part of the revolutionary movement that was actually realized, but it was realized through a very repressive state apparatus. So we kind of constantly face a revolutionary subject and very politically invested society, an expansive civil society, and a repressive state apparatus, and colonial ambitions at the same time. And navigating these three elements at the same time together has been quite a political challenge. And this is what's happening today. That's what started uh, as a genuine and legitimate economic grievance for the rising inflation, uh, and how it immediately turned into a political movement for regime change in Iran, and how different actors are exploiting that situation is quite complicated, and it's very hard to comment on that. That what's the extent of the involvement of the Israeli agents, American interventionism, and of course, the underlying issue is that there is indeed a genuine and legitimate protest happening, and all these different forces who are trying to instrumentalize it and exploit that moment towards advancing their own political objectives.
I would like to ask a quick follow-up question before staging a brief conversation between yourself and Bassam, who's done quite a bit of research on Syria and similar dynamics around anti-authoritarianism and anti-imperialism. And the follow-up has to do with one of the essays in the middle of the book, where you do this very beautiful and I think quite insightful move where you think with the now deceased Hale Lajevardi, and you speak about a sentiment of despair in her thinking, but also you speak about how she theorized sovereignty. You just mentioned this in your previous how there's two ways of thinking about sovereignty, if I understand correctly. One is sovereignty at the level of the state and defending the Iranian state's and territory self-determination. But a second is this notion of individual sovereignty. And you speak about how Lajevardi's work extended sovereignty towards individual rights, individual freedoms. I'm wondering if you could elaborate that a bit in relation to, again, the current conjecture, perhaps, and what you just noted, and to give listeners some more familiarity with the meat of the book and the arguments that you make there.
Lajevardi was a sociologist of everyday life, and she did a lot of field work for her dissertation, which then was turned into a book. And one of the issues that I tried to highlight about her work, as you said, was the question of sovereignty of the individual. And I want to highlight also this issue that sovereignty of the individual does not necessarily mean individualism. It's about the possibility and the ability and of participating in society without external repressive political apparatus. And so that sovereignty of the individual could express itself or manifest itself in building communities, in collective action, in different forms that is not necessarily the equivalent of a liberal individualism. And it's not about the individual rights, it's more about the possibility of forming different kinds of associations and assembly and subjective presence in society. And I think that the revolution of 1979 created that possibility. I always in my work, I try to highlight this, that possibly the most enduring legacy of the revolution was the creation of that sovereign individual, an individual who is aware of his or her uh, social, historical, and political circumstance, and and of course, when that's an important part, because then if you look at the question of sovereignty at both state level and at the individual level, then that's a way I thought that we can solve the problem of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist politics and the question of repression, because then a repressive state apparatus automatically undermines the legitimacy of an anti-imperialist position. And so uh, and I thought that she sort of introduced in her book, she has the little frontispiece from Somerset Maugham on the razor's edge, and that the razor's edge is the post-revolution. I thought that this is the post-revolutionary subject, that you constantly walk on a very, very thin, sharp line of sort of navigating between hope and despair, and this is what revolutions do. I think that because they, on the one hand, they generate a very deep and profound sense of hope, the possibility of social change, changing your conditions and circumstances. But while that kind of fundamental change constantly faces with disappointment, with disillusionment, and therefore with despair. And we see that today. I mean, what's happening in Iran at this point is the expression of a fundamental, profound hope, while that hope manifests itself towards thinking about anything but this regime, for example. That, and I think that that's a sort of a manifestation of despair, because if you sort of on the one hand have hope for foundational change in society, and you find yourself unable to do so, to deliver that, then you kind of try to resort to political actors who are not necessarily thinking about your well-being, and don't share the same kind of aspirations that the masses of people are expressing on the streets.
Thanks, Behrooz. I'd like to ask about a topic that is what can be called a can of worms, which is something that so many of us who were following the uprising in Syria from
Mm,
2011 until 2016 intensely, and then, of course, things sort of tapered down after.
mm,
We were in a situation where the discourse was so polarized between those who focused on the local and those who focused on the external, basically the
mm,
geostrategic dimensions, which I never realized, or I never knew why this was a puzzle personally, because we should look at both. Uh,
mm,
but even those who were looking at both were accused either of being traitors to the uprising cause or traitors to the stance on imperialism or anti-imperialism. How do you, in your case, the case of Iran, based on so much of that you have actually written, and I've heard you speak, and really would appreciate your take on how today, in today's environment, what can we learn from your work, and what do you think would be the approach to not balancing? I don't like this word. It's very much of an American
mm,
media
mm,
word that whenever I hear it, it bothers me, not
Hmm.
because literally it's a problem, but because of its usage in the American
Hmm.
mainstream. But how do you deal with or address the local and the strategic and the geostrategic without undermining either, without undermining the actual conditions in Iran, which can be quite harsh as we are seeing, and even in times of peace, and then the geostrategic positions of states like the United States and certainly Israel in the uh, historically, but definitely in the past year. How do you navigate both?
Hmm. It's a $64 million question, Bassam, and as you said, I also don't think that we need to understand this in binary terms. There is no binary, I think, there to say, uh, do you support Iranian people's protests, or do you support the Iranian state's anti-imperialist position? And I think this is a trap. This is a sort of a conceptual trap that you can sort of address without arguing against this kind of binary formation. And and I think that the reality is that one cannot ignore and be blind to the geopolitical question that in which Iranian state and Iranian society is located. Because I don't think the geopolitical question is not a question about Iranian state. This is the question about Iran as a whole, as a society and as a state. Because those people who say that if you bring up anti-imperialism, then you are defending the Iranian state, or in the case of Syria, whoever talked about, arming insurgents and Islamic State terrorists uh, is wrong, then that meant that you are defending Assad regime, and but I think that the question of geopolitics is not necessarily only an state question. This is a question for the entire society, and I believe that Iranians who are protesting uh, need to be conscious of that, and at no moment they should separate their struggle against uh, repression, against economic hardship, and demanding social justice. At no point and no moment they should separate that struggle from their anti-colonial, anti-imperialist position. And this is up to people are who see themselves part of this rising movement, to constantly remind people, constantly remind all those organized parts of these protests, because a lot of this is totally unorganized. But those parts who are organized, like a lot of labor unions, are part of this movement. And I happy to see that actually those organized parts of this movement are very much conscious of anti-imperialist, anti-colonial core of their struggle, because one cannot be anti repression and fight for economic justice without addressing a world order in which these states operate. And I see constantly in Iranian circles that people say that the Iranian government should respect uh, world order and international rules and regulations, while no one else respects that world order or international laws and regulations. And I think we all have come to this realization that 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 if a state wants to be respectful to international order at this conjuncture in history, that means to become a client state of Western powers. and there is no other way that you would be considered as a state that is respecting the world order. And so I don't see this as a dichotomy. I see it as a constant struggle for people who want to express their dissent, and that dissent always needs to be articulated in the context of regional and global politics. And I don't see them as two parts of the same thing, but I see them as integrated part of the same struggle.
So, following up on that comment and that observation, I would like to ask a question about how you assess politics, policies, decisions made by leaders in the Islamic Republic. And in particular, I'd like to talk about your discussion of Ebrahim Raisi's election in 2021 and your framing of that election around concerns pertaining to political economy, promises that were made, and decisions that were made that did not deliver on those promises. And the reason why I'd like to ask this question builds off of the question and answer, the exchange you just had with Bassam, insofar as some of the anti-imperialist leftist polemics that we've seen over the past 5 years have gone to the point of celebrating a figure like Raisi as an anti-imperialist hero, in particular when his helicopter crashed in 2024. Your book offers an alternative. It seems to me that Raisi's election is a breaking point in terms of the effort to build a sense of hegemony, which is the central concept in the book. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate how it is that you talk about Raisi in particular, but how it is that you assess critically policies in the Islamic Republic by state leaders in recent years.
Thank you for that question. I thought that one of the issues that we need to keep in mind is that for better or for worse, the Islamic Republic, since the time of revolution, had deeply cared for the question of legitimacy. Legitimacy in a sense that is bestowed upon them by their constituents. And that's why I always argue that it's difficult to understand Islamic Republic as a totalitarian state because they carried on their political order always with an eye towards popular legitimacy. And Raisi's election, I thought, was an end to that position, and because they disallowed all other candidates from running for president, and Raisi was a very incompetent political actor, and I thought that they decided to form a consensus around a character which could not offer any kind of strong position on policies and changes in society, or to become a threat to any other kind of sources of power under Islamic Republic. And so the way I saw that was that Raisi was the end of an era for the Islamic Republic to invest on the legitimacy of its own rule. But I think that they very quickly realized that they cannot operate under those premises, and what the circumstances was of his demise, I don't know. Some people say he was assassinated. Some people say that he was eliminated by the government itself. But I think that this was his demise was also a note on the collapse of that position to sort of move away from a question of legitimacy and the state. The problem is that they thought that by eliminating other competing factors in power, they could institute policies that would alleviate some of the economic hardship, and they quickly realized that was not possible, and the sort of allowing Pezeshkian to run for presidency, if somebody who's coming more or less from the reformist camp, was an indication of an admission of a mistake by pushing Raisi as the president. Of course, it's always been the case that when people, I have a friend, Romanian friend, so many years ago, when Romania was all still under the communist rule, and he said that, when people ask, so what's happening in Romania? He always responds that you need to look at Romania as a bottle of wine. Which year? And the question in Iran is also the same issue, that if you look at the 46, 47 years of post-revolutionary state, if you're trying to figure out what exactly is happening, what type of government, what kind of state is in charge in Iran, you need to ask, which year are we talking about? And because of this kind of internal competition and conflicts, which continues in the state, we are far from a unified state, and so they attempted that with Raisi, but it was a failed attempt, and so now we don't know with the current protests whether Pezeshkian can offer any sort of solution to this kind of political issue for the state, but that's yet to be seen, I guess.
One of the major events that occurred during the Raisi administration, of course, was the Women Life Freedom movement. And you speak about the Women Life Freedom movement in this book, and you talk about different concepts of revolution. And you seem to suggest a non-Jacobin concept of revolution. And if I may, I wanted to quote a particular line in the book where you write, "Politics, Iranian style, borrows heavily from Bazari culture, Herculean in the wholesale, horrendous in the retail." And so I'm wondering if you might elaborate on that line in particular, and if you might do so with a gesture toward the possibilities afforded by the Women Life Freedom movement and some of the social movements we've seen in recent years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very, very good. So I didn't expect that line from the book, but that's good. That's a very important question, because when I say that kind of Jacobin politics, it's often the case that any movement in Iranian society is immediately connected to the possibility of seizure of power and decapitating the state. I mean, when I said that it's sort of a Jacobin politics, that's my reference that any movement, if there is a labor movement in Khuzestan, if the oil workers in gas industry, natural gas industry, and immediately people want to connect that to the possibility of decapitating the state or overthrow of the state or a regime change. That's what I mean by wholesale. I mean, if you want to have a politics that takes time, effort, piecemeal transformation of building a movement, of trying to make that movement hegemonic in society, rather than thinking that you want to take over the state and change society top down. And so I think to my mind, this is sort of a Gramscian, if you wish, it's a Gramscian understanding of how a movement is built. And my argument for about women life freedom movement was that, for example, that the movement needed to have specific, feasible demands rather than immediately jumping into regime change. Jumping into regime change is a Jacobin understanding of politics, I think. While putting forward feasible demands that can be accomplished. For example, I wrote a piece at the time that the movement needs to put forward a demand for the end of morality police, and and many people were very critical of this because they said this is an opportunity to overthrow the regime. And if you say that the demand should be the abolishment of morality police, it means that you want to continue life under this regime. And my argument is that actually, if movements are put in the position of achievable goals, actually they grow. They don't end, because then people understand that they have this power of accomplishing things that otherwise individually they could not accomplish. This is a sort of invitation to collective action that that is translated into meaningful change in society. And I think there are many, many examples in Iranian society since the time of revolution that these things have happened. And again, in labor movement, in student movement, in freedom of expression, that things had changed in civil society. And civil society, and that's why we have a very actually vibrant civil society in Iran. Very important intellectual circles operate in Iran. We have a good book industry, for example, in Iran. But these are changes that have happened not through demanding a regime change, but through demanding piecemeal, if you want to continue that bazaar metaphor, a kind of artisanal kind of change that focuses on one area of social life rather than a total transformation of state and society. That's what I mean, that kind of Herculean in wholesale, meaning that regime change is a wholesale, but then painstakingly asking for changes piecemeal that would little by little transform society and makes these social movements, makes these demands, put them in a very hegemonic position before the transformation of the state. I hope that makes sense.
It does. You mentioned the concept of hegemony in your response, and I would
Mhm.
like to make a slight pivot here. So bear
Mhm.
with me. It's going to take a couple of steps,
Sure.
but I'd like to get us onto the topic of knowledge production and the format of this
Mhm.
book, where you write in an
Mhm.
essay form. You say at some point in the book that there are two questions on the table. One is the question of the Islamic Republic, and the other is the question of Palestine. And when I think about the phrase, the question of Palestine, immediately I think of Edward Said, who obviously wrote a book with that title. And Said also thought with Gramsci, and he thought about hegemony. And part of his project was to attempt to correct for misrepresentations of the region, of the Middle East, by showing readers the reality of circumstances on the ground. Now, this is where I'd like to make the pivot to your discussion about knowledge production in the book. At one point in the beginning, in the introduction, you say something quite striking. You say that you were ambivalent about writing about Gaza because you realized at the point that power was operating by exposing what it was doing as a way of saying, we can do this and you still can't stop us. Whereas the writer's vocation, you understood it, was always to expose what had been hidden. And so I'm wondering if we can take that as a point of departure to speak about how you understand your vocation as a thinker and as a writer. And then from there, perhaps we can speak a bit about the format of this book, which is a collection of essays that were written, as you over 20 years, and you have the dates on each of the essays. So we're almost getting these snaps in time. And I wanted you to elaborate that and share with us a sense of what you were thinking when you put these together as one coherent book.
I'm not quite sure if the book is coherent, but hopefully the readers find it coherent. You know, but I'm glad you brought that up because it is a different time, and that the way things unfold in the Trump era, I don't think that Trump era is substantively different from earlier American political order, but in form, I think is quite different. In a sense that everything is done out in the open. We were having a conversation sometime earlier that what was happening, for example, in Gaza, was a form of lynching, you know, and this lynching has a purpose. I mean, exactly the way lynching had a purpose in American South, that it was done actually in order for others to witness it. And it was not done in secret. It was not done in a way that could be denied, but actually it was done in such a way for all to see. And I think the Trump era is ushering in, or has already ushered in, an era of lynching, which is modeled after Israeli genocide in Gaza. And the genocide in Gaza also happens in front of the world's eyes. And indeed, you know, the fact that the Israeli soldiers posted their atrocities on their social media further shows that these are acts of lynching, and then that makes it a bit different and difficult for a writer to unpack it, because what are we unpacking? If people are not scandalized by seeing these scenes of atrocity, if people are not scandalized when Trump openly calls the entire continent of Africa a shithole, then what are we unpacking? What is my role as a writer to say that what he really means is XYZ? Well, actually, what he really means, he is saying it very explicitly. And that makes our job as writers, as thinkers, as scholars, so much more difficult, because now we are dealing with audiences, with readers who are exposed to these horrendous positions, statements, and acts of atrocity very openly. So, what do we do about that? And I thought that when I said that, that I was uh, I was paralyzed. I mean, in writing. So what am I going to say? What am I going to tell my students? What am I going to tell people in public that like what's happening in Palestine? Because what's happening is very, very directly communicated without anyone's intervention. That is an ongoing act of genocide. And in a sense, I thought that if earlier, like in the time of the late Edward Said, you needed to uh, unpack and show what's behind the curtain in order to create a new position and try to become hegemonic in that sense. At this moment, there are no curtains. The curtains are already drawn, and people can see what exactly is happening on the ground, and uh, and that's why we see a very extremely polarized societies because people have basically have made up their minds about which side of politics they stand, and and but like in the case of Iran, I think there's some level of a similar thing that I saw that the Iranian state actually is showing the bodies of people who were killed during these protests, and but that's a sort of a different kind of act. Earlier, they tried so hard to hide it, and now they just put it on display, and I thought that this is kind of a similar form of um, political violence that you show to people that what you are capable of, and this is another form of lynching. I thought that makes it a bit different, not a bit different, a lot different from earlier forms of political violence that we were used to and we used to write about. But nowadays, the terms have changed, and there is a different kind of engagement that is required from writers, and including myself and yourself. That we find it very difficult to carve out a position that sort of reveals what happens behind the scenes, or deeper on the ground.
Sorry, I
Bassam,
had
are
to.
you? Yeah.
I had
Okay.
to I had to fix the mute button.
Uh,
Behrooz, I mean, I think we can talk about so many aspects of the book and as it relates to the current moment. But let me continue in the vein of knowledge production and
mhm,
say something about the book and ask you about your method. One of the important and striking features of this current book was its form. It compiles essays you have written over more than 2 decades, and this comes after the two books, Remembering Akbar and Foucault in
mm,
Iran, which is his work after he
mm,
visited Iran, which
mm,
is
mm,
controversial or considered
mhm,
controversial by some. Can you tell us a bit about
mhm,
your method as a writer and what you mean by a history of the present in this current book and how it relates to your previous work?
mhm.
So, quite a few questions.
Yeah, you ask hard questions, and so uh, one of the things that I wanted to do with my book on Foucault in Iran was to sort of take up the question of writing about historical current events and turning them into philosophical statements about history, about politics. And this is what I think Foucault was trying to do, to use a journalistic writing uh, as a way of articulating a particular philosophy of history. And this is what I also try to do in this book, that to say that what happens on the ground always is connected to a particular understanding of history. And because in Foucault's case, he tried to sort of move away from that kind of teleological understanding of history, and then to sort of move away in such a way to highlight the contingencies of events. And here I also try to show the contingencies of events and how many actors are involved in any particular moment in history, in from 2003, 2004 to the present time, and uh, and actually advance a position that in every given moment things could have been different, uh, and there is no inevitability in the way things turn out. And this highlights the position of the subject, this highlights the position of actors on the ground. This kind of emphasizes that we should not think of the unfolding of events in a particular linear way that with inevitable results. And 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 this is the way I thought of these essays, and the reader can see in every given moment that how different kinds of decisions, how different kind of engagements, how different kinds of policies could have produced different kinds of results. And so the place we are, and this is a way of not fetishizing the current moment, the present time, as the inevitable point that that we find ourselves in. So you can see that in different events. You can see that in different moments of history that decisions were made, actors are acted, and institutions perpetuated themselves in particular ways that were not necessarily inevitable. And I'm hoping that the collection of essays can convey that kind of position in this sort of essay form, that hopefully we can sort of think about the different possibilities. I always thought of the present time, the condition of possibilities. And even now that these protests in Iran are happening, I want to move away from fetishizing the movement and developing a critical engagement with this movement, exactly the same way that in earlier points like women life freedom movement and movements for freedom of press in Iran, the student movements, labor movement, in every given moment there were different kinds of engagement that could have produced different outcomes, so long as the observer, so long as the writer does not fetishize, does not avoid any kind of critical engagement with what is happening on the ground. And I'm hoping that this book would help to do the same kind of form of critical engagement with the protest movement in Iran, and and hopefully, move towards a kind of result that is void of any kind of repeat of reinstituting institutions of repression and loss of life and this kind of massacre that is happening.
I would like to end our session with one final question about the other book that you published in 2016, Remembering Akbar,
Mhm.
which is a collection of essays as well, but they're memoir essays about your time in prison in the 1980s.
Mhm.
And you begin this book, this recent book, with a recollection of an incident, an event that occurred in prison as well, and you relate it to broader political structures. Oftentimes, discourse, knowledge production about Iran sees people say, we see people say, I know better than you because I was there, or because I spoke to somebody who's in Iran, and we have to listen to what the Iran are saying. And so I'm wondering how you approach that matter and how you've navigated writing both in a register of memoir, but also as a critical thinker and an analyst of broader macro historical patterns, structures. So maybe you could share a bit about how you opened this book, and if you'd be willing to comment briefly on the navigation between the personal and the political.
Yeah, thank you. There are two things that I always try to avoid in my writing, in my scholarship. One thing in terms of positionality, I never wanted to position myself as a victim of atrocity, and because when I went to different places and gave talks, and people always told me that, you say these things about the Islamic Republics because you have no idea how much people suffered under this regime. And I always internally thinking that you have no idea how much I suffered through the atrocities of this regime. But I never wanted to put that in the forefront or in the front stage of my political engagement, because I thought that this would have a silencing effect, because then I was in a position to say that, you have no idea what went on in the past, because I know, because I was there. And so one thing was that, I didn't want to um, cash in, so to speak, political capital because of my personal history. And I think, and I still think, it's wrong, and no one should um, extend their individual experiences into a political project, because it would be very skewed. It would be uh, non-reflective of the political circumstances. And the other thing that I discussed a little bit of that in Foucault in Iran also, that I'm not quite sure whether being there puts you in an epistemologically privileged position. And most often I think that being there puts you in a disadvantage, because you carry a particular memory of events. You carry a particular memory of how things unfolded in the past that you need to overcome, actually, because that is a very particular standpoint from which you see history. And in order to write something scholarly or political, you need to basically transcend that memory, and to be able to situate yourself in a position that of basically forgetting your own personal experience, or the fact that you were there, to be able to see things in a very general, more comprehensive way. So I two things therefore. I mean, no narrative of victimhood, and secondly, being there, not a um, uh, epistemologically privileged position, but rather, the opposite of it, a position that you need to work in order to transcend it. And that's why it took me actually almost a decade to be able to write about the Iranian Revolution after, entering the academia, because I thought that I needed that kind of time to create that distance, that I won't write from the position of being there. I wanted to develop the ability of writing uh, after sort of transcending that particular experience, my individual experience. So it's a sort of, and I remain skeptical of people who say that I was there, I know what happened. I always think that if you were there, therefore chances are that you actually don't know what happened, because that view, that memory, that recollection is very limited and extremely prejudiced. So that's how I write. That's how I engage my earlier books. The first book, Islam and Dissent, and Foucault and Iran, and also, the Remembering Akbar, and this book, all are written with that in mind. And this is a very conscious effort on my part to be in that position, not to take that kind of positionality as a constitutive part of my writing.
Thank you so much, Behrooz, for the time you spent with us today. I think that's a perfect segue to our subsequent sessions, where we will be talking in greater depth with other guests about the work you've produced over the years and other dimensions of knowledge production about Iran in relation to all of the events that are rapidly unfolding today.
Thank you so much, Arash and Bassam. This was so meaningful to me, and also I think would be productive to continue that conversation and different aspects of the Iranian Revolution, post-revolutionary politics.
Absolutely, Behrooz. It was very illuminating, more for me than for either of you, because I am not in this field. And I want to just clarify to people watching that this series was conceived prior to the emergence of protests in December 28th. So it was actually in the works for a
Yes.
couple of months prior. But when you talk about Iran or Syria or any of these states that are that do not toe the line in the region, it is very likely that something's going to come up. And of course, Palestine goes without saying.
Yes.
So we will be back with everyone and with others to discuss other matters. And thank you both for joining. Behrooz, it's the first time we speak on camera, so I'm delighted
Yes.
and I'm honored to be in your company.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bassam.
Take care, everyone.
All right. Thank you.